Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am at AK Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 154. And this episode, we're doing a bit of a retrospective on not the original handheld game console, but really the one people think of. We're talking about the Game Boy and the Game Boy itself. And to help facilitate that discussion from the Lo-Fi Gaming Podcast, we have Alex. Alex, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to talk about the Game Boy. It's one of my favorite systems of all time.
It's a good one.
So this topic came to me. Geoff and I try not to do too many retrospectives in a row because we like to cover other broader gaming topics, but we've done some genre retrospectives, and now we've done a console retrospective as well on the GameCube. And though I thought the Game Boy Advance would be our next one because I never shut up about that console, I listened to your episode very recently on Lo-Fi Gaming as of when we're recording on Super Mario Land 6 Golden Coins, which is one of my favorite video games ever. And I like how you mostly browbeat your brother into loving that game. I mean, he did genuinely love it, but you were like, you're going to play this game and you're going to like it.
It's an inevitability.
And I loved the episode so much, I suggested to Geoff that we reach out to you to bring you on here because clearly from that episode alone, I got the sense that you really love the Game Boy as a console.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's pretty important for my whole video game journey. I mean, it's the first console that ended up in my household as a child, and it's really what turned me onto video games. We weren't really allowed to have video game consoles in the house, but eventually, one of my neighbor friends snuck a Game Boy in. Then I started playing the Game Boy, and like over time, we started playing more and more. But so it holds a special spot in my heart. And Luke, my little brother and co-host on Lo-Fi, is about 6 years younger than me. So, you're saying that, I bullied him into liking this game. And for me, it's so important. It's such an important part of my gaming history. And for him, he kind of missed out on the importance of the Game Boy. I mean, he respects it, but it's just a little different. So I always have to lean on him a little bit to really understand how great these games are sometimes.
Oh, yeah. Well, and especially it's interesting when you consider the Game Boy probably had one of the longest viable life cycles out of most video game platforms, console or handheld or anything like that. And so you got to see lots of waves of design or of ideas. And something like Super Mario Land 2 6 Golden Coins versus the original Super Mario Land showcases such a leap in evolution of what is possible and capable. It's an interesting system, environment, ecosystem to go back to and go, how much is nostalgia and how much is, damn, this is just good.
Yeah, it's wild when you think about it because when it came out, the Nintendo was out, but then towards the end, as Game Boy finally sunsetted, I mean, they were doing stuff with the N64. So that's a huge gap.
Yeah, the Game Boy was officially discontinued on March 23rd, 2003.
Yeah.
And they stopped supporting it for repairs at Nintendo when they did the same thing for the Famicom and Super Famicom and all that on October 31st, 2007. So considering how that is nearly 20 years of support and about 15 years of actual commercial sales, in that same way that I know they were selling PS2 games well into the PS4 life because they were soccer games, but it's still a matter of viability and visibility here.
Yeah, I think before we get too far, it's important to talk about the Game Boy came out in April of 1989 in Japan and then July in 1989 in the US. And like now most consoles are day and date very often for Nintendo, but like back then there were huge gaps and that was so close together. The EU wouldn't get it till almost a year later. Over a year later, actually. But like talking about that lifespan, like this console came out so close to the Japan release, so we didn't have to wait very long in the way that we've waited for a lot of other games and other consoles. And I think before we get too far into why we love this console, since clearly the three of us are fans of it, we should talk about the origins of like how we got a Game Boy, what we first played, maybe our first game. And I'll go first. So famously, Geoff and I are Game Gear lovers on this podcast, and though this is not about the Game Gear was the first handheld console I ever got, because I looked at that in the Game Boy, well, the other one's in color. Obviously, that's the better one. I was very wrong, though I love my Game Gear, but I didn't actually get a Game Boy until I think maybe a year or two after it came out. And like I bought it off a friend at school. It's such a like childhood story. Like He didn't want it. I think he had just maybe gotten the color. Maybe not. It just might have been that he was bored with it or didn't enjoy it. And so I bought it from him and he let me take a pic of any of his games in that purchase. And so I took two, Tetris, of course, and Kirby's Adventure. So probably the release of Kirby's Adventure will dictate when this was, which I'd have to look up the date. But like, I remember going home and playing Kirby and going, this is the best video game ever made. I didn't know video games could be like this. Kirby has been a long-running favorite franchise for me for a while, but it's such like a childhood, at least I feel like the U.S. childhood story of like, yeah, I bought it from a friend at school. And I loved the Game Boy. I took it everywhere. I always had extra batteries in my game. I had one of those obnoxiously big like Game Boy cases that you put the console in and like the games and extra batteries you'd shove in wherever you could fit them because you know they're going to run out. And like on every car ride, under the light of the street lights as you're driving on the highway trying to see what I'm playing before we had front lights or back lights. Geoff, what about you? When did you get your Game Boy?
Well, I did not grow up with an original Game Boy brick. I have them now, but those are retro buys or other friends' collections making their way into mine. My first Game Boy was the Game Boy Pocket,
Hell yeah.
which I got probably late 1998, early 1999. I would need to date this through Toys R Us flyers because I remember this is after Pokemon Red and Blue had come out, and they were selling the Game Boy Pocket for $50 and selling Pokemon Red and Blue for $20. And I saved up my allowance, and my mother told me if I save up enough to buy the Game Boy, she will buy the game. And so the Game Boy package for me was getting the blue Game Boy Pocket and Pokemon Blue to match. And that cartridge stayed in there for a very long time before I got any other games, and I didn't care. It was phenomenal. And eventually my brother got a Game Boy Pocket as well, and so we started, either his birthday or my birthday, we'd pick up a few games, pass them back and forth, and I got to go back through some of the backlog. I remember falling in love with Donkey Kong GB, 6 golden coins. I played Kirby's Dream Land 2 on a friend's Game Boy so many times that I finally got my own copy. There was a lot of those that just kind of, after all of the Game Gear, Pokemon was what got me into Game Boy, and I didn't look back.
Amazing. What about you, Alex?
Yeah, so I don't know for sure when the original DMG made it into the house. It was probably 96, 97, and I definitely didn't buy it new. It was a situation where one of my neighbor friends, maybe they had an extra, maybe they were tired of it, but it ended up in my possession, and I really did enjoy it a lot. And I played a lot of Link's Awakening and a lot of Metroid, which are also games that came with the, hey, you want to, you don't have any video games in the house, play these, which I'm pretty sure is my friend Andrew. So bless his heart for doing that for me. And it was actually Andrew's mom in 1998, same time with the Pocket. So the Red and Blue came out for Pokemon, and she bought us Game Boy Pockets and the respective Red and Blue. So she gifted me Pokemon Red and a Pocket, and she gifted her son Andrew Blue. So it was, it's one of those deals where I kind of lucked out because Pokemon, you need to have 2 so you can catch them all.
Yeah.
So that was my official, had it land in the house, and it was actually mine. Although I still have that DMG on the shelf, that's actually mine too.
Incredible.
Those giant Game Boys, those bricks were so hefty. I mean, not compared to the Game Gears we mentioned, but still pretty hefty, especially compared to the Pocket, which was kind of the perfect form factor. Or even as we get on to the other Game Boys later on, they always got smaller and sleeker. But that first one really, it earned the name the Brick because it was pretty chunky and pretty heavy. What I love about the Game Boy is it's the earliest days in my memory of getting not only original games that would have only been on the Game Boy, but alternate versions of existing games elsewhere. A thing that we don't really have anymore, I feel like now that the Switch has kind of blurred the lines between handheld gaming and console gaming. If there's a version like The Witcher 3 ported to the Switch, it doesn't run as well, it doesn't look as good, but it's the same game. The content is still the same. But Earthworm Jim on the Game Boy plays nothing like Earthworm Jim on the Sega Genesis, much to my dismay when I got it. I was like, portable Earthworm Jim, awesome. Oh my God, why can't I see anything coming on the screen? What is this screen crunch? But, then you look at the games like Wario Land and Super Mario Land 6 Golden Coins we mentioned before, even the original Kirby's Dream Land, they were designed for that square screen. And for the most part, had some of the best level layouts on the game because all those first-party Nintendo titles were we're not just trying to make something fit, we're designing for that space.
And it's interesting to see where those sort of divides happen, where sometimes a franchise, a company really was trying to give a one-to-one conversion. And depending upon when the game came out, they sort of succeeded or didn't. I put forth that Adventure Island 1 and 2 on the Game Boy and DuckTales 1 and 2 on the Game Boy are fantastic ports, fantastic conversions. They are delightful, incredible. The Mega Man games are, the first 4 are just weird remixes, and so they could take that time to design it. Not all of them are successes and not without their flaws or problems, but you're right. It's very interesting how there was certainly, I would say, around 1991, a real feeling of the NES was chugging along, long on the tooth, however you want to think about it. The Game Boy had been going on for a few, and the Super Nintendo was in the States. And so there's this interesting sort of tier system of, as a game coming out on the NES that a lot of kids have, the Super Nintendo for that fancy option, you could put Super in the front of it, or the Game Boy option, which was a shrunk down, you think about Castlevania 3, Super Castlevania 4, or Belmont's Revenge kind of thing. And those are very different, although each their own, and I'm saying Belmont's Revenge, Castlevania 2 on the Game Boy for this reason, all equally good in their own way experiences.
Yeah, it's pretty wild, like when you think about the development for games around the Game Boy and just the fact that it had such a long tail. So you have this system that the developers are working for, and it wasn't that they didn't have the, that they were trying to catch up with the technology. It's almost like the technology was dated. So it was more so like trying to figure out how to get these big ideas and big games into a cart that was relatively small. I want to say like 8 kilobytes or something like that. The RAM on there was 8 kilobytes.
Something like
I
that.
think the ROMs could be up to like a megabyte or something. So like just try and take these big games and crunch them down on this little handheld unit. It's impressive what they're able to do.
And because that sort of design was what let the Game Boy thrive. Because, Matt, you mentioned how a lot of us were suckered into the Game Gear's bright colors and fluorescent front light tube, irregardless of the 6 AA batteries or whatever else. I'm trying to remember Gunpei Yokoi, the designer of the Game Boy, one of his philosophies, and I believe it was lateral thinking with withered technology. The idea of using things that were a little more established, a little more known, and piecing them together and making something that really works. So yeah, the Game Boy was designed to not be the fanciest, shiniest toy on the production line, but it was made to be durable. It was made to last on those 4 AA batteries for a good long while, and they did. And it was fairly easy to develop for, as far as I'm able to tell from what I've read. And from there, you give it a long lead time, a long tail, and people are going to understand it. People are going to get used to it, and you learn all of those fun tricks. And so it's very interesting to look at Game Boy as a Trojan horse for so many things, because all of those designs and its handheld nature got it into a lot of homes. I imagine, Alex, you are far from alone in being someone that grew up in a household where we don't have video games in the house. We don't have anything plugged into the TV. That's just a fancy toy or something to that effect, as well as people who wouldn't necessarily think of themselves as gamers, or there's a run button to Mario kind of feeling. I don't want to hold too many buttons at once, but one of the big things, and we have been burying the lead on this, is Tetris.
Yeah.
Game Boy did not launch with Tetris in Japan, but when it launched in America, it came packed in with Tetris. And that showcases the capabilities and the finer points of what a Game Boy can be for you. It was a link cableable game, so it was not necessary to be a 2-player game, but if you wanted to explore, there were options there. And it is a cultural touchstone on so many levels. And Tetris on Game Boy was not the first version of Tetris. It wasn't even the 20th. But it was one that got it into a lot of hands without needing a specific computer, without needing to plug something into your TV, and it got Game Boys into the house.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, I don't, like, console warriors have no credibility anywhere on this podcast and really in the world, but like this cry that Nintendo only supports casual gamers now is such a stupid idea, because your point about Tetris, like, it's a puzzle game that anyone can play. And just as many parents as kids bought that console for Tetris because It's a puzzle game they've been playing on Windows forever and in so many other places. And it's so approachable and so easy.
It's not violent.
It's not violent. It's just a puzzle game. And like, I think about how, as much as we decry sometimes how they are slow to get to the newest technology or the shiniest thing, their strategy about wanting to be inclusive in the games they release is a working strategy that is always successful. It's not even a question. And like eventually the Game Boy got tons of stuff that you could consider violent or more adult. I mean, I think of The Return of Joker, which is a Batman game, but like it's a Batman game, right? But there was plenty of stuff that was designed for kids or kid friendly or family friendly that made this a console that was easier to convince parents to buy. The same way the NES, like with the light gun, like the full deluxe setup that you could get, made it a family experience. And then the Wii and so on. And the Game Boy is the earliest sign of that, along with the NES, because like you said, Geoff, it's not the first version of Tetris, but it is by far one of the most definitive versions of Tetris. I would say only Tetris Effect very recently may have dethroned it as like the best version, but like people still refer to the original Game Boy game as like one of the versions of Tetris, even though again it wasn't the original by any stretch.
Well, it's certainly a ubiquitous title that people have a lot of nostalgia for that certainly holds up when you go back to it. We all played Pokemon, and Red and Blue, we can have our fond memories of it, but I would not recommend it to somebody as their first Pokemon game in the year 2023. But if someone wanted to play some Tetris on the Game Boy, I encourage it, I support it, I want everybody to do it. Kind of feeling.
100%.
Yeah.
And it's actually, as far, I've got I started collecting more seriously for Game Boy in probably 2018. And so I've got hundreds of games for this thing. And still, Tetris is the game that gets popped in there the most.
It's one of those where you can lose a little time, a lot of time, but no matter what, it's super easy to start a game of Tetris. And that also is one of the strengths of the Game Boy, and one of those things that's talked about, but still feels like a little bit of a, I don't know if I want to say subtle feature, secret weapon, whatever else, but in the design of games made for Game Boy, those games that we look back on and go, oh man, these were incredible. Whether it was Link's Awakening, whether it was Kirby's Dream Land, whether it was Tetris, all of them were designed with the pick up and play style. They were meant to be a use case of a salaryman in Japan playing on the subway from one stop to the next, a kid in the back of the car, an adult just catching a little moment to themselves either at work or at home or wherever else, no matter what. And taking into account probably hand fatigue, eye fatigue, any of those sorts of things, no matter what, it was a secretly or not so secretly accessible toy. Nintendo's history as a toy maker really shines through in what the Game Boy is and its legacy.
Yeah, I mean, I remember playing so much of Kirby's Dream Land. I keep wanting to say Adventure because Adventure is the one I played the most. But like, I remember spending so much time with Kirby's Dream Land as a kid, and then when I became an adult and like hadn't played it for many years and finally went back to it, the surprise I got when it took me an hour to beat it, I was like, I spent so much time with this game. I thought it was so much longer. And like that time distortion. Now, the original Pokemon games are actually pretty long games, especially for the time. But a lot of the other games were designed for this bite-sized experience. And honestly, I think it made them better. I think the reason I love 6 Golden Coins as much as I do is because each stage is, a couple minutes long. Some of the ones towards the end are a little longer, but like they're all pretty bite-sized, and like there's save points and you can complete different worlds, and you could do the worlds in any order, which was my favorite part because every time I go back to it, I try to start with a different one instead of starting with the Mario zone, which is my favorite zone because it's you're literally inside a giant mech Mario. Where's our mech Mario game where Mario just drives a mech of himself?
I mean, Wonder's coming out. We might get it.
Yeah, you never know. But like, I think Game Boy is the era of games like the Nintendo where I don't remember finishing a ton of games. I know I played almost every game in this library. On another podcast, we recently guested to talk about the many versions of Metroid 2. And like, I know I owned and played Metroid 2. But I don't think I ever beat it back then. I had Turtles, Rise of the Foot Clan, Fall of the Foot Clan, whichever one it was. I loved that Turtles game, but I don't think I ever saw the end of that game. And I think that's also kind of funny when looking back on the Game Boy. And I feel like this is an experience for a lot of kids who play games even now is like probably fonder memories of the experience of playing the games than completing them. And I'm like, I love completing games now, but at the time it was like, that didn't matter. It was just if you had fun playing the thing, whether you could finish it, beat it, was it approachable, didn't matter. It's just, did you have fun in the moment to moment pressing the buttons and doing the thing?
It's funny. It strikes me that a lot of late 80s or even all 80s gaming and even into the 90s, there was a lot of push, hullabaloo, and marketing for bringing the arcade experience home. And a lot of that was, it looks as good as the arcade does. It plays as good as the arcade does. It's all these sorts of things. The Game Boy would never be accused of looking too much like an arcade game. But because of that pick up and play nature and the fact that those games, ones that didn't have passwords or save features, you were throwing yourself at stage one over and over again, even more so than those sorts of games like Contra or Ninja Gaiden on the NES. I think the Game Boy kind of captures an aspect of the arcade experience that is truly unique to the arcade in that sort of insert coin, play game feeling. It served well for puzzle games, and it served well for a lot of more action, shorter experiences too.
Yeah, I love that you two are touching on this because, I love long games. I love big games today. And I love to finish games. But like, Matt, what you're saying, this idea of like picking up games and not even finishing them. And Geoff, I'm too young to really have experienced the arcade, but old enough to experience the Game Boy. So for me, it's a sweet spot. And I feel like it really set the foundation for like this love I have for arcadey-ish video games and short plays. And that's something that I love about this system. And you don't really see it, or at least I don't really see it as much in the gaming sphere anymore. I mean, I'm sure it exists, but I think, Matt, you brought up with Kirby, like the idea that you can beat it in 45 minutes to an hour. People today, if you go to the internet and look this up, they'd be like, that's whack. I can't believe that. The game, they didn't put any effort in this game. But I love that. I love that so much. And the replayability is there because even though it's 45 minutes, like it's an awesome jaunt every single time you pick up Kirby. And that 45 minutes to an hour, I love it every single time I do it. And you can just knock it off in an afternoon. Just be like, I feel like playing Kirby. I'm going to beat Kirby today. And if you're really feeling a challenge, you can do the little bonus, like extra hard mode afterwards. Right. And don't get me wrong, I do love my 30 plus, 100 plus hour games as well. But there's something to be said about that gaming experience where you can knock off a game in 45 minutes to an hour that I just love. And that's what the Game Boy, it excelled at.
Yeah, you see that sort of experience nowadays in the indie game space and a little more digital releases. But the fact that, these were mainline releases. And it is interesting to see where and how much. I mean, the Saga series started off on the Game Boy with the Final Fantasy Legend. And that is certainly a long game, Link's Awakening being what it is. And I even think of other little in-betweens because, battery back save was a whole thing. But this also reminds me of just an experience I had a couple of years ago where I was determined to try to play through as many of my collected Game Boy Color games as I could and finding which ones to play on commute on the subway, right in the subway in New York City. And I remember having just this beautiful moment with the first Mega Man, Dr. Wily's Revenge, realizing that, you know what? It does take me about the time of a one-way train ride to get through a stage. Well, is that a problem? No, because I've got a little notepad, and I'm not even going to note it on my phone. I'm going to bring back code books the way that I did when I was a kid. I am going to draw up the password for Mega Man, Dr. Wily's Revenge, and get through the game like that. And so I would have the kind of thing of sitting down on the subway. All right, cool. I got through Cutman, and now let's go on this part here. And having that as well. There's that versatility that, the Game Boy could support a 40-hour game, a long RPG, a long adventure, and it could do just the setup knockdown. The amount of pinball games on the Game Boy makes me so happy.
Yeah.
But you could also kind of have that middle of the road too. I don't think Ninja Gaiden Shadow, I think it was called, on the Game Boy, I don't think that had passwords. It certainly didn't have a save feature. But I played that first stage a lot.
Yeah, I think the strength of my memory of Game Boy games is stronger with the early parts of games and definitely a little looser with the latter parts of games, except for specific titles that I played through to the end many times. I want to talk a little bit, Geoff, about what you brought up earlier about the jump in technology even within the Game Boy. I think the strongest examples we'll have of that is like Kirby's Dream Land 1 to 2 and Mario Land 1 to 2. Like Mario Land 1 was designed to look like Super Mario Brothers 1, more pixel, kind of blocky. And then by the time the second Mario Land game had come out, there'd been so much evolution in the Mario Brothers series already that like it's just unrecognizable comparably, right? Like Mario looks completely different in the same way.
Mario looks like Mario.
Right. Like how we envision him now. And then I think about, like you talked about this a little bit on your episode on Lo-Fi Gaming. The design of Wario at that time, he was so much bigger than Mario. He was so much more grotesque than Mario. It was this idea of like this blown up sprite that then ended up driving his design more forward, I remember feeling kind of ripped off in Wario Land 1 when it's like, oh, I'm like half the size he was in the other game. What the hell? Should be taking up like a third of the screen. But obviously, I'm not a boss anymore or whatever. But like even that jump from Mario Land 2 to Mario Land 3, Wario Land, like also huge changes and evolutions. And I think it's very easy to think that the Game Boy is a very particular graphic style and limitation. But the reality is, because it was around between the NES and SNES days, they got to use that knowledge of the consoles to their advantage on the Game Boy. And it really is showcased when you jump from initial titles to sequels in a lot of the series on the Game Boy.
Yeah, very much so. And it's interesting, too, to see the times where I love looking at lists of Game Boy games, not even just like top lists, but just the games that came out. And so many of them feel like orphaned sequels because they make the miniaturized version of the NES or SNES game and go, all right, it's Bubble Bobble Part 2. I mean, Metroid 2 is a canonical sequel.
Yeah.
But the amount of other times where it was just kind of okay, well, we're not going to make the original game, but we still want to sell, and it is using the title, so here. And the weird and wild experiences you got from that, too.
Yeah, I mean, Donkey Kong Land is a great example, right? We had the huge advance of Donkey Kong Country and the incredible pre-rendered sprites and amazing work by Rare. The Donkey Kong Land games eventually, like, kind of, and we saw this a lot during that generation, they kind of become an amalgamation of the console games, but they're not one-to-one. I think Donkey Kong Land was primarily Donkey Kong Country, but, like, when you get to the sequels, it's like they're incorporating things from a multitude of games in the same way you mentioned with the Mega Man games. Like, because there was such a backlog, you could kind of remix it a little and make them their own games, but they're technically not. They are just kind of homages to existing games, which is way more popular now than it's ever been before.
Although, to be fair, the original Donkey Kong Land was not a port of Donkey Kong Country. The story within it and the design of it was Cranky Kong saying, I could have done that and done it better. All right, you do it then. And you are taking a meta journey through Donkey Kong Country, through Donkey Kong Land. I know I'm missing a few details there, but it is important for me to say.
Yeah.
It was not made to be a one-to-one, but it looks like a one-to-one and it does a lot. But the same way that in Link's Awakening, because it's a dream world, you can have Yoshi show up. You can have enemies that look like Kirby. You can have Bow Wow, the Chain Chomp, be a part of it. And the sort of remix, not even just within its own series, but other Nintendo properties. There's a certain amount of, I don't want to quite say laissez-faire about it, or a certain feeling of, how seriously do we need to take this? I mean, it's the Game Boy. And that allowed for some truly wild moments like that, where you can get, well, it's Donkey Kong Country, except, well, why are all these crossovers happening in Link's Awakening? It's a dream, don't worry about it. It's also the Game Boy, don't worry about it, kid. And I'm sure there's other ones that I'm not thinking of, but that level of relaxed levity or loose boundaries in terms of strict design. And also this was during a time when, the NES would have its second game come out in a franchise and they go, do people want more of the same or something wildly different? Fuck it, wildly different. So having that kind of thing with Game Boy going the same, but no, not the same, I think contributes to its legacy as well.
I think it's important that we dive a little bit deeper into the game library. I think that Pokemon wouldn't have the success it has now without its original release on the Game Boy. I think it was iconic. We all played RPGs around this time, but I don't think I ever imagined an RPG could be like this. And I don't even know as a kid I considered Pokemon an RPG. I don't think I knew, really. I just knew it was Pokemon and it was different. For me, the seminal entry was Yellow, which I had played Blue, but when Yellow came out, it was one of the first ones I bought with my own money. And like the idea that after I had watched the anime for as long as I did in the States, I could have Pikachu walk around with me. Like that's all I ever wanted in Pokemon. The fact that we had to wait so many generations after that to do that with any Pokemon we wanted still breaks my brain. Because like that was the best part about Pokemon Yellow, is that you could talk to Pikachu. He was there with you. He looked like the Pikachu from the anime. It was just one of those things. But I feel like there are so many iconic games for this console, but there's something I think particularly important and special besides Tetris about Pokemon and how it launched 1,000 ships as far as the rest of that franchise, because it was so hugely successful in the States in a way. Like Pokemon, I feel like, is one of the first games in the early days of video games to transcend gaming, right? To be more than just a Game Boy game. It was a franchise so quickly.
Yeah, it was a phenomenon.
Yeah, I want to say it sold 31 million copies, which is nothing to scoff at. That's red and blue, and then when yellow came out, it was another 14 million. So I mean, that's a lot of Pokemon.
That's a lot of Pokemans. Multiply that by 151, and how many Pokemans is that? It's a lot. How many Mew rumors were told on the schoolyard? All of them. All of them.
And the fact that you had to have 2 games to catch them all, like that probably led to more system sales. Like,
oh yeah, it got me to buy one.
Right.
Yeah.
I definitely have memories of I had the DMG and the Pocket, and then I would borrow another Pokemon copy so that I could trade back and forth to myself, just so I could get the full Pokedex.
Oh yeah, as an adult, I definitely have had those times where I'm just sitting there like I've got 2 DMGs or whatever plugged into each other, and I'm like trying to make full Pokedexes on my copies of red, blue, and yellow. I was like, yee, this is fun for me. Yes, it actually is. It's a lot of fun.
We've mentioned a bunch of really great titles on the Game Boy, but is there a standout one too that we may not have mentioned yet that like you just remember sinking so much time into? Because like for me, we talk about the incredible amount of pinball games and spin-off games that were on the Game Boy as well. Kirby Pinball Land is probably one of the games on that console that I sunk the most time into and gave me the love of pinball games. The biggest crime that Nintendo has committed in modern gaming is the fact that we don't have any spin-off pinball games. We haven't had a Pokemon pinball game since what? Sapphire? That's ridiculous. Like, I don't know what they're waiting for.
I'm very public about my want for more Nintendo pinball games.
Yeah.
Very.
And like that game, like I sunk so much time into Kirby's Pinball. I think also because of the arcadey nature that we talked about before. Are there any games that come to mind for the two of you that like beyond the biggest hits that you sunk too much time into?
Can one ever say one spent too much time with Donkey Kong? And not Donkey Kong Land, Donkey Kong 96, Donkey Kong GB, however you want to look at it. One of the few truly native Super Game Boy enhanced titles. And an incredible encapsulation of so much of the Game Boy for me. In terms of my own nostalgia and memory and looking back as this Yutz on a podcast, talking about it, it's an incredible thing where it's a title that you start playing it and it's the original 4 arcade levels of the Donkey Kong arcade adapted for the small screen, and that's fun and it's great, and it does the whole ding 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 ding, it does the little jingle, it goes how high can you go, all that fun stuff. And you get to the final level, you pull all the pins and Donkey Kong falls and you expect to just do it again. No. Donkey Kong has taken Paulette and is going to a whole new series of levels. I believe around 96 of them. And there's triple jumps, there's weird move physics and things that Mario can do and tricks that happen, and it becomes a find the key, unlock the door. And you can also collect the hat, the umbrella, the handbag to get bonus points. You encounter Donkey Kong twice per world. There is this whole thing, and it naturally has a battery backup. So I don't think I've ever completed the game. But I have restarted it so many times, and I'm never upset about that. The first time I put it into the Super Game Boy that I have now, for whatever circumstances, whatever reason, who's to say, putting it in the Super Game Boy erased my file.
Oh, no.
And I was not mad at all. This gave me an excuse to witness the whole game through the Super Game Boy. It was wonderful. And it's one where you can see the beginnings of a lot of Mario's later movements, like triple jump stuff, like big, wahoo kind of movement on the Game Boy. And I don't know where they all sit on the development timeline. I don't. But it's there. And again, they got it on the Game Boy, and it doesn't pull anything particularly flashy, but it is solid and incredible. And I'm certain it's a game that the more I look into what went into the programming of it, the more my mind's going to be blown. It was a favorite when I first had a Game Boy Pocket, and it's a favorite now. I love Donkey Kong for the Game Boy.
Fun fact, I guess Donkey Kong in that game is actually Cranky Kong. I learned that the other day.
There you go. There you go.
Right.
Love that.
Right.
Game Boy is for Cranky Kongs.
Yeah.
This is apparently news, but now that I'm saying it, it's not news.
I'm trying to think. I mean, a lot of the heavy hitters, I spent a lot of time. Link's Awakening, like I played that game over and over so many times.
Oh yeah.
There's definitely other like not as well known games that I was playing as a kid as well, but I just can't recall off the top of my head. But in my adult life, I'm a sucker for a shmup. So Nemesis and Solar Striker are really fun on the Game Boy.
Yeah.
You know, we were talking earlier about this want to get the arcade into your hands, and they do an okay job of it, you know. But it's still handheld, and they did a good enough job where I will, you know, put 20 minutes here and there in every, you know, whenever I feel like playing, because those types of games I truly enjoy. You know, they don't even need to have a story, but they have that arcadey feel. Alleyway was another one that I think I had as a kid. That's kind of fun, and that's like had this silly like a little like a Mario sprite at the beginning to tie in the Nintendo flavor or whatever.
Yeah.
But there's just so many. I mean, the Space Invaders too. So all those arcadey little hits, like even today, I still put a lot of time into those ones.
Oh yeah, no, and there was a lot of fun twists. And yeah, no, shoot 'em ups converted oddly well to the Game Boy. When you think of your standard big arcade genres, I mean, fighting games, they tried.
The Mortal Kombat port is so bad.
King of Fighters, an effort was made. An effort was made. Thanks so much. But yeah, no, like shoot 'em ups and everything go. And no, Link's Awakening was absolutely fantastic. And I also would feel amiss and feel like I need to turn in a card somewhere that I don't realize I have if I don't mention Mario Picross.
Sure.
In terms of puzzle games on the Game Boy, Mario Picross is one that my love of Picross games is well documented on this show. And if this is your first episode, listener, I freaking love Picross games. Mario Picross is a delightful title, and I love that the Mario Picross series is getting some love on Switch Online. And yeah, no, I have, just through circumstance, I have Picross 1 and 2 for the Game Boy, but I have the Japanese versions. So I can't read any of the menus. I've gotten very far into the game. I don't know if there's any features I'm missing, but I'm having a wonderful time solving picture puzzles. That kind of bridges the gap between an arcade experience and a phone game. It's very interesting to, again, look at the Game Boy as arcade interpretation, as proto-smartphone, as whatever else.
You're touching on another major pocket of games that the Game Boy put out, and that's puzzlers. Like there's so many good puzzlers on the Game Boy, like Daedalian Opus, Amazing Tater, Tailgater. Like there's a ton, and they're all good, and they really get the brain going. Like a lot of them they're just enough to like frustrate you sometimes, but they're also easy enough to keep you going. Like there was a ton of great puzzle games on the Game Boy.
And there were a couple of Tetris ripoffs, like Wordtris and Hattris.
Yep. And like Nintendo, like even building on their own spin-off franchises, like Dr. Mario, probably arguably the most famous version of it is the Nintendo version, but I played the Game Boy version so much. And like it was the early days where I realized I could have a console version and a handheld version. I can play them both. And like I loved puzzle games on this. And I've always loved puzzle games, but I think it's easy for me to forget because some of the classics, I don't think of them as puzzle games. Like obviously Tetris and Dr. Mario are puzzle games, but to me they're games where things fall. Like I don't know, like
they're Game Boy games,
right? Yeah. But like I agree. Like I think the Game Boy and the Game Boy Advance had some of the best puzzle games probably in the history of video games, and I think it's because when you're working with limited space, like we've talked about on the show before, limitations breed creativity in a way that now that we can kind of do anything, it's great, but it also means that things are like the best and most advanced and prettiest they can be, and that's not always the answer. The Game Boy forced people to, well, how do we make it work on this canvas? And it made for some of the best puzzle games in the industry.
Totally. I know this is a retrospective, but it's, we live in an exciting time. Like we grew up with the Game Boy, there's a lot of love for the Game Boy system out there, right? But there's been a resurgence over the last few years where a lot of people they're modding these things. They're adding backlit screens, they're, bivert backlit, bringing that play. Because like, let's be honest, that old DMG is going to have some screen degradation today in 2023. Like it's not going to look as good. It's going to blur. But people, the technology is there to upgrade these things, and people are still playing. And not only are people still playing, people are still developing for the Game Boy, which is really cool. I've played some games that came out in the past couple of years that are made for the Game Boy. They were released to the Game Boy. Like the Deus is a really fun one. The Machine is a really cool one.
Yeah.
There are these great story-based games that they garner their inspiration from some of these greats, but then they add a lot of flavor from today to them. Like it's so fun to play the Machine, and there's all these like all this commentary on capitalism and all this shit. It's just so much fun.
Oh yeah, no, I've recently, and even larger platforms such as limited run games are starting to release some of those Neo retro games, those Neo Game Boy games as physical releases. My copies of Bubbo Escape and Phobos Dare arrived pretty recently. I haven't yet gotten to delve into them, but I'm excited about Phobo Dare just because it's a horror game on the Game Boy. And again, the retro aesthetic allows for those kinds of things. And it's very interesting, too, to look at a lot of these games and feel as though there are three major, development trees. This but. And it's Link's Awakening, it's Pokemon, and probably Tetris. It's a puzzle game, except it is a top-down, turn-based RPG, but it is a top-down adventure game because that's where a lot of folks go nowadays. That's where a lot of folks are thinking about things. And Tetris, Link's Awakening, Pokemon, everybody knows those games. Everybody loves those games. And that gives you the shorthand that you need in order to get people in to look at it and then enjoy it. Because it's not as if top-down adventure games, Zelda doesn't have that cornered. And that's not what makes it great necessarily. It is great and it is that. And thus others can be as well. Now, something fun that I wanted to talk about as well briefly is the amount of accessories the Game Boy generated in its lifetime. When it launched in America with Tetris, it was showcasing the two-player link cable, which Pokemon also resurged. I have memories sitting on the corner of the bus stop for middle school, trading and battling Pokemon. It's a very important, very formative thing. But you also have, I'm going to touch on some of the dumber ones that are just things that exist. Like you can go to the Gaming Historian's YouTube page and watch a bunch of these. There's a pocket sonar that can be used that has its own fishing mini game built into it. There are, I believe, I don't know if this was ever fully released or not, but there was a sewing machine that you could load up patterns through the Game Boy that would then go through the sewing machine, as well as a number of other absolutely bananas things that I am not thinking of, but also were similar to that. Those are ones that pop up in my head. But one that is in that vein, but a lot more people know about, was the Game Boy camera.
Yeah.
Which another accessory that withered technology, lateral thinking, has a lot of its own charm just playing the thing. You don't even have to take many pictures, but also has a lot of modern support. I just recently got a USB accessory for my computer where you plug in whatever game you want and you're able to get some information about it, play it a little bit emulator, dump save files and reload save files. And for the sake of the Game Boy camera, you can dump and save photos.
Is it the GB operator?
I know there's that one, but I used the Game Boy camera as the photo booth at my wedding. So
cool.
I can't tell you what a relief it was to finally get those pictures onto a computer. No one else cares. Awesome. I do.
Yeah, I mean, some of the accessories I remember most from the Game Boy were absolutely idiotic. Like there was this conglomerate that was like a magnifying glass and a backlight, and it like locked onto the top of the console or whatever. Like I have such vivid memories of using this monstrosity while just trying to play my Game Boy at night. There were, battery packs and chargers. And like, I remember once I got the battery pack that plugged into the back of the Game Boy, I didn't need the actual back plate anymore. And of course, eventually that battery pack died. And so I had to go back to using batteries, and I no longer had the back plate. And they didn't sell the back plate separately because why would they do that? Now they would, but back then they didn't. So I had to tape the batteries in or whatever. Like, I just remember really using all of these cool and random things. And like an accessory that works with the Game Boy that we mentioned briefly before, the Super Game Boy, was awesome. Being able to play Game Boy games on a console, like I loved that way technology talked to each other also. Like there was I think Nintendo has a history of ridiculous peripherals, but like it really started with the Game Boy because the NES had a few, like Rob.
But most of them are third party.
Right. Besides like Rob and the Zapper, they were mostly third party Game Boy had a ton of first-party ones, and then also a flood of third-party ones that were just ridiculous. And something like there was a stand for the Game Boy, so you could play it without holding it. Like, why would you even want that? Like, it's just, I loved all of these different weird things that you could use to enhance your Game Boy experience.
And I mean, it is worth noting that, things like the Pocket Sonar wasn't first party.
Right.
I don't think. But still, it's there.
Yeah.
And nowadays, the Game Boy camera, people are 3D printing mounts so you can put actual glass, the lenses that you would put on a digital SLR camera. And people are taking phenomenal and wild photos using a Game Boy camera. Again, the same way that there's software to create chiptunes and create music using the Game Boy as a synthesizer, which is something I know a great deal more about. But the cameras, you can look that up, and people are doing incredible Game Boy camera photography without changing the software at all.
Mm-hmm. It is really cool. And to couple with the camera really nicely is that Game Boy printer.
Yeah.
Which allowed you to take those photos you were taking and then print it out on this little, is it thermal? I guess it's thermal paper.
It was thermal receipt paper, yes.
Yeah. And then, but it's difficult to get a hold of it today. But the original paper was also adhesive, so you could print out your pictures and then you slap them wherever you want.
Right, and it wasn't just photos from the camera. There was a lot of other games that utilized it, or at least a handful. I know Link's Awakening DX had functionality with it. There was a camera shop. There were moments you could have photos taken and they'd be printed out. It wasn't as if anything you could change or set up, but you just unlocked, you can print this sticker now. Have fun.
Right.
Which was, at the time, mind-blowing.
And I think one of the most functional accessories was probably that worm light.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, Matt, you mentioned, I forget what it's called.
The Nyko, I think, was the company.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's the magnifiers with the lights. Anything that added a light so that you didn't have to, when you're on those road trips, you didn't have to catch those street lamps. Or if you're like in bed or whatever, way past your bedtime, trying to get some gaming in, you could have your lights off, a little bit more sneaky.
I don't regret having the Game Gear during long road trips. I had the power back to it, and I was able to, we would drive a lot at night, but yeah, no. You made it work. Game Boys make do.
Yeah. And before we wrap up, I think we should briefly mention, though, we could have a whole separate conversation about this console. The successor, like the Game Boy Light and the Game Boy Pocket, were other Game Boys. They didn't change that much, like other than the form factor and stuff. But the separate console that came after, the stopgap between the Game Boy Advance and the Game Boy, was the Game Boy Color, which added color, a sort of palette of color to old games. But then there were specific games like Link's Awakening DX and many others that were designed for vibrant color on this console. And we could probably, like I said, do a whole other episode on it, but it is important to state how huge this was, because sprite graphics are still some of my favorite graphics, and Game Boy Color sprite graphics are some of the best. I mean, you look at Link's Awakening DX even now, and it's some of the coolest and best graphics, and had dungeons designed based on color, which was like such a cool idea when you finally have color in your game that had existed pre-color.
Yeah, that game in particular is one, Nintendo put out their Switch remaster or remake of it, and I think it's great. But that is one game that it is, in my opinion, it's damn near perfect. Like, you go back and they're 1-to-1 other than a bit of a graphic update. It's amazing to me what they're able to do with that game on the Game Boy.
Oh, yeah. No arguments. No notes. Superb.
And I think that we will eventually do a follow-up on the color, but I think seeing Nintendo take the slower route to color handheld consoles, and then the incredible leap the Game Boy Advance takes, which we'll talk about when we get to that, I think that process made for longer lasting and better quality games. Whereas the Game Gear, which I love, has some standouts, but for the most part often felt like shovelware, and what just didn't seem to have the same kind of quality that I feel like, and for sure not the same staying power. Like, I love Sonic Triple Trouble, but I say that to normies and they're like, I'm sorry, what game? Who's Fang the Hunter?
Because they know Knack the Weasel.
Right,
obviously.
exactly. Obviously, they get confused. But I think like the Game Boy Color is just another example of how ahead of its time the Game Boy was and how long lasting it's been.
Yeah, its influence is everywhere. People are still modding it, making it work, updating it. It is a touchstone of gaming, a landmark, and one that I don't think we've plumbed all of its depths culturally speaking. I think there's a lot to be gleaned from the influence that it had, the titles that it produced, and what experiences it gave us.
Well, fun fact, the Game Boy is also the first video game system, and then Tetris, coupled with that, the first game to be played in outer space.
That's right.
That's right. Amazing. Love that.
Truly uniting the space race.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
I will not fall from orbit, but the blocks will fall. Other dad jokes about Tetris in space.
Well, Alex, thank you for joining us for this retrospective. This was wonderful.
Thank you too.
Before we wrap up the show, I would love for you to tell folks where they can find you online, find the show online, and give a little elevator pitch on what exactly Low-Five Gaming is.
Yeah, well, thanks again, you two. This has been really fun. Low-Five Gaming is the podcast that I do with my co-host and brother Luke. You can find us at low5gaming.com. That's got links to all of our stuff, wherever podcasts are. And, you know, if you love Game Boy, Matt mentioned earlier, but we just did an episode on Super Mario Land 2, so that's a nice place to start. But it's a backlog book club conversational style podcast. We do one game a month. We pick a game, try and beat it, and then we basically talk about it in book club style. We invite folks to join along the way. We always announce what game we're going to be playing, and they can join the Discord and play along with us if they'd like.
Amazing. Wow. Playing only one game a month. What's that like? I can't even imagine as someone who we release bi-weekly. Thank God that I don't actually play all the side quest games. I'd probably die.
Oh, yeah. Playing only one game for content per month. Also now feeling like, what's that like? It sounds really nice, though.
We do have a segment called Side Questing at the end where we talk about all the other games we got into.
Yeah. Of course, yeah. It's never just one when you're gaming.
I told Alex very early on when I started listening that they're one of my favorite gaming podcasts on the sole reason that there's only one episode a month, so I can actually keep up because I listen to so much stuff.
That's valuable, yeah.
Listeners, do you like the Game Boy? I'd imagine if you're still here that you definitely do. And so if you do, what were some of your favorite games? When did you get the Game Boy? Did you not get the Game Boy until you were playing modern games? I know Geoff often talks about how some of his gaming past is actually his gaming present. So what are some of the ways in which you engaged with the Game Boy? Or maybe if you don't like the Game Boy, tell us why. We always love to hear the other side of the argument as well.
And thank you for listening politely to the end of this episode before unleashing your negative opinions of the Game Boy, which we would like to hear as well. None of this is perfect. And what games do you remember that you wish you could play but you never did? And maybe now's the time to go back to it. What are the games you wish they could release on Nintendo Switch Online? What franchises, forgotten titles do you want to have further development or new notice on that? Are you somebody that develops titles for the Game Boy still in 2023? Please tell us about it. We'd love to talk to you about it because that is super freaking cool. And we want to hear all these opinions and more from you. And there are so many great ways to get in touch with us to let us know. You can find us across social media at Fun and Games Pod. If we're on a social media platform, that's how to find us. You can email us at funandgamespod@gmail.com. Let us know what you thought of this episode, previous episodes, what you'd like us to talk about, and who you'd like us to talk to on future episodes. If you want a great one-stop place to see a lot of our content, what we're making, and if you have the inclination and the ability, maybe support us financially as well, you can visit our Patreon. All of our episodes and a lot of our content is free on there. You don't have to donate a cent. But if you do, we greatly appreciate it. It's patreon.com/funandgamespod. And if you do support us in that way, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our patrons. And we'd especially like to shout out those on the high scoreboard today. Alex Lavelle, Case Aiken, Daniel Needon, Roger Reichart, Alejandro Alves, Film It Yourself, Patrick Edwards, Rob Tremarco, Robert Proin, and Sean Bowen. Thank you so much for your support. Please enter your initials. I cannot guarantee they will still be in the high scoreboard when you turn the Game Boy on again, though.
Yeah, unfortunately, batteries die. Man,
the amount of times I put my initials in Tetris and it never stayed.
And of course, if you would be as kind as to rate and review not only Low-Five Gaming once you've listened to it, or you know what, don't even listen to it. Just give it 5 stars. That's all we need. But please rate and review our podcast as well. You can go to Apple and Spotify. That's in the show notes. Tons of other platforms also let you rate and review. Good pods. Please rate and review us in all the places you can. It's really the thing that helps us the most. If you can't contribute financially, that's the next best thing. It really helps us to get featured discovered and more folks to find the show. I'd mentioned in a previous episode, we had multiple feeds in the Spotify, so we had to destroy. I don't know why I went to destroy, but we did destroy one of those feeds. Unfortunately, that feed had all of our reviews on it, but didn't have any of our show art. So if you have reviewed the show previously and were like, yeah, I've already reviewed it, maybe go double check Spotify because it's probably gone, and we would love for you to re-review it so we get those reviews back.
And also, please visit certainpov.com where you can find episodes of this show. You can find a permanent invite link to our Discord server where we continue a lot of these discussions, and links to other fantastic Certain POV podcasts. No matter where you reach out, where you may or may not review, where you share your thoughts on this, we love hearing them because we couldn't do the show without you. This is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Do you feel like you're the only person in your circle who wants to go deep about video games regularly?
We were like that too, until now.
Welcome to Crossplay Conversations, the brand new bi-weekly topical video game podcast from Luke Lewis,
Joseph Hooper,
And Jacob McCord.
with many years of breaking it down separately on shows like the Left Behind Game Club, Player Podcast, and Lukewarm Games, the gang is finally coming together to publish their gaming group chat in audio form every other week.
Expect roundtable reviews of the latest games, profiles of upcoming indies, and insightful conversations about essential topics in the video game industry. All with a mostly positive, insightful, and fun style.
Crossplay Conversations debuts on August 1st with brand new episodes hitting every other Tuesday. Help us out by subscribing on your podcast platform of choice to get the first episodes delivered straight to your feed.
And follow us on Twitter at Crossplay Convos for updates about the show.
Cheers and happy gaming.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.